Why don't you just do what works? All this farting around, all this fancy stuff, you being creative, it's dumb. Why don't you just put on a great church service and let us enjoy it? I'd love to say that I've only received this bit of feedback once, but I have received this bit of feedback perhaps more than any other. Why all this messing around? Why don't you just give it to us straight, like normal, so we can appreciate it? Now, I think the reason I get this comment is because I'm an auteur. I'm an experimenter. I'm an innovator. I'm a tinkerer. I like to play around with form. I like to play around with medium. I like to play around with a message. I like to explore. I mean, that's who God made me to be. Not everybody's made like that. That's me. So the inherent risk of being involved in anything I do is that you're going to get exposed to something you can't always anticipate, and you might not always like. You probably definitely won't like. But let's be honest, you're not going to like everything about church anyway, so get over that. But I am sympathetic when people will say that in my church or in the ministries that I've run over time. Why can't you just do what works? And the truth is, because the thing that works doesn't always work. I have this adage that every time you repeat an idea, it loses 50% of the impact. And it's like somebody playing just the same couple of notes on a piano. It drives people nuts. In fact, one of the things that we often do at the chapter house, we'll gather in the catacombs down here and we'll use our DJ turntables to create kind of an endless loop of soaking music. And we'll, have a break beat in the background and then some instrumental or ambient music that plays over top. And usually it's on a 1-minute loop or a 2-minute loop that just repeats for the whole, hour or whatever that we're down here. And for some people, particularly baby boomers, it drives them crazy. It drives them absolutely nuts. They just can't handle the droning guitars or the low rumble of the synth bass that just makes them insane, and they got to leave. Now, whether that's just a preference of a different age group or a different generation, the truth is none of us like to hear the same thing again and again and again and again and again. None of us actually want to hear the same sermon. None of us actually want to go to the same cantata or participate in the same outreach or do things the exact same way over and over and over again. Because while there might be some comfort and security in the fact that an idea gets repeated, the impact of that idea is lessened over time. If you go to Vegas and you see the Cirque du Soleil, it is amazing. One of the best theatrical presentations in modern history. You go and see it again the next night, it's still pretty amazing, but you don't have the same experience. Man, you go a third night in a row and you're a bit embarrassed about how bored you are, even though you just paid whatever it is, $400 for a ticket. There's just something about that repetition that, while it's comforting and familiar, is nevertheless deadening. So when people say, why can't you just do what works in church? I go, because what works for you doesn't work for everybody. What works for you isn't going to work again and again and again, because the reason the things do work in the first place is because they're born out of such a robust tradition, a rich sense that I want to just keep trying new things in new ways. And of course, there's lots of places where you can go where you can get the exact same thing week after week or month after month. Just none of them involve me. And for that, I'm very sorry if that's uncomfortable. I have found that people's receptivity to my strange ideas is greatly enhanced when I consider their mindset and the setting in which they come to worship. So do a little experiment with me. Think about your most meaningful liturgical experiences. And liturgy I'm using as a synonym for worship service, Sunday morning service, special service like a 4th of July service or Canada Day service or a Good Friday or something like that. Just think about what made the absolute best worship experience of your life, the best liturgical experience of your life. And think about the mindset that you had. What were you expecting? Were you anticipating that God would move? Had you spent time preparing your heart? Was your imagination caught up in the way God was speaking to you? Were you going through a difficult time such that you desperately needed God to, quote unquote, show up and meet you with a particular word or a particular sensation so that you could overcome life's challenges and difficulties? And then what about the setting? I mean, did you come into a place and have a kind of wow experience where you go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I wasn't quite prepared for how beautiful this is, or how intense this is, or how sacred this is, or how majestic this is. Or did you come into a place and the setting was totally stripped back, and so you had the impression that it was just you and God, and you were in this serene, stripped back kind of environment? Regardless of what your mindset was and what the setting was like, as a leader, if I could feed forward to people what kind of mindset they should have, and if I could give them hints about what kind of setting they were coming into, then they had a much better experience with whatever I was designing, even if what I was designing was not to their preference. I mean, if they knew they were coming to a DJ liturgy service, then they were more willing and able to accommodate the strangeness of it. If they knew they were coming to a theatrical presentation on Halloween, then they could accommodate the shift in their expectations that was going to happen from a regular Sunday morning service. If they knew that today was going to be jazz worship or percussive worship, or today was going to be all a cappella worship, or that we were going to chant the liturgy and sing it rather than just have any musical instruments. If they knew that, then they could prepare for it. Now, sometimes they would prepare by not coming. They would say, well, that's too stupid. I don't want to do that. And that's fine. Actually, that's better than having them show up and get sort of surprised by something that they didn't like and that they didn't choose. But as a leader, I could always do that. And really, I could always help them, exercise their right not to be there, or put on the right sort of experimentation framework in their heart and their spirit and their mind, and then have a much more positive experience. I didn't always know to do this. I was in local church ministry for almost 30 years, and I'm sad to say that I really only figured this part out in the last couple. But I learned that if I could start feeding forward through Facebook posts, through social media posts, through the announcements on Sunday mornings, through print material, through print media, through a sense of anticipation, through a kind of a cheerleading team of early adopters who were in on it, who could spread the word. But if I could get people thinking about what it was going to be like and how they were going to experience, and to kind of imagine and dream and give them some questions in advance. If this is uncomfortable, why do you think this is? If this isn't designed for you, who do you think it might be designed for? Who should you bring with you? What will you, who will you tell this story to? And, is there any way you can find any merit in it? And is there any spiritual value in being uncomfortable? And, what would make this the best possible experience, even though it's going to be uncomfortable? If I could ask these questions, then people were much more willing to give me my head and let me experiment, because it felt less like my experiments were being done to them, inflicted upon them, like I was, whipping my creativity around like a cat of nine tails. And it would feel much more instead like we were all in this laboratory together, like we were together experimenting with form and function. And that's what this episode of the podcast is about, liturgy. And I'll be honest, there's no way I can talk about my experiences of liturgy in 1 hour, but neither do I think that you're going to want to hear the 7 hours of opinions that I have about liturgy. Of course, much of that I've already published in many places, including Then, Now, Next, including Sleeping Beauty, including Christian Innovation and Design. There's lots of material out there on it already from me, not to mention the dozens and dozens of primers on the Chapter House website. But I thought, at least for today, I'd talk about the experiments that I've done in liturgy, experiments in form, experiments in function, and then playing with conventions in liturgy. Really a way to train people up to be able to borrow from the best of the different Christian traditions that go into the liturgical practice. And then really I want to talk about storytelling as liturgy, because if there is a quote-unquote Dave McDonald method, it's to make everything a story, and there's a little tool that I use for that, and I was very successful teaching other people how to design meaningful spiritual experiences when we thought of them in storytelling terms. So first, let's start with experiments in form, different kinds of liturgies that I've done over the years, and whether or not they were any good. One that I really resisted was the talk show format. I was, talk show format is a really common thing for mega churches and the '90s and early aughts to try. Everybody wanted to be, well, I guess back then it was Jay Leno or Conan O'Brien or Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or Dave Letterman, whoever. But I always really resisted it because I didn't like the absence of a spiritual experience. I mean, I really think church ought to be spiritual. When people come to church, I want them to experience God, the Holy Spirit. I want them to have a sensational encounter with God in which they feel like their hearts are touched, their spirits are lifted up. I want them to experience a great deal of positive energy so that they come home with or they leave church with a new sense of what's possible, of what God might be capable of. And the talk show format just seemed like some cheap jokes and maybe a tiny little bit of human interest as you would interview different people either in the church or in the community. But John Oliver's Last Week Tonight really sort of inspired me because I liked the way that he designed his opening monologue, that sort of tight 10 minutes that John Oliver would always use, where he would juxtapose deep insights with ridiculous observations. So we did a talk show format, and people hated it. I didn't hate it. I thought I was really funny as a John Oliver kind of host, but I don't think anybody liked that at all. And the rest of it was the same kind of struggle as I always imagined it would be. People enjoy, congregants enjoy seeing people get interviewed. It's a good way to know people. The music was good. It was a professional music, high energy, positive quality. But again, it felt like just felt like music that you were supposed to appreciate rather than an experience of God in worship, and that always feels like a miss for me. And then nobody nobody liked the talks. I always thought those talks were really good. I wish I'd published those scripts because I thought they were exceptionally funny, but I was wrong. Apparently, the person most likely to find me amusing is me, and maybe, no, not even my mom. Yeah, it's just me and my dog. We think I'm hilarious. Everybody else, well, they struggle. Anyway, we did a talk show format modeled off of John Oliver. We did several experiments with electronic dance music. We did a digital EDM liturgy where the whole service was just 5 different DJs, Aaron Zrayek, Kelly Heath, of course, Davey Buchanan, Del Belcher, and they were just up there DJing the whole way through the service, and then I would get up and talk in parts. And there again, because we had such highly capable musicians, particularly in blues and rock and jazz, that was a hard left turn for our people that they didn't really appreciate. They didn't get it. They didn't like it. The music was unfamiliar to them, and our high caliber musicians felt like that kind of music wasn't even real music because it was all, synthesizers or drum and bass or whatever. So that was a flop. We did other DJ series that were more effective, but none that were universally acclaimed. I think my favorite was one we called Church Records, where what we did was we got samples of all these different historical voices, Martin Luther King, John Perkins, Billy Graham. We got all Rick Warren. We got historical quotes from Dylan Thomas, and then we could bring those quotes in so that you didn't just see the quotes on the screen. You did, but also you could hear those quotes in the middle of music, and in the middle of the music, and we could trigger them and sample them and layer them in between all of the verses and choruses and components of classic worship songs and of hymns, almost as though those people were the ones providing the exhortation in the middle of worship to all the different things that we did. And I really liked that series, that DJ series, because it was about 45 minutes long. We did 3 of them, and I wanted to trace the origins of Christian spirituality through the Orient, through Africa, and through the West. In large part because it's a great concern for me that people tend to assume Christianity is a white man's religion. They tend to assume that Christianity is a Western religion and that we can't really separate Christianity from its cultural context. But the tradition of Thomist Christianity in India, of Christianity in the Orient, of Christianity in places like Turkey, in Asia Minor, just has its own flavor. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Coptic Church has an amazing focus on the incarnation of Jesus. I mean, modern evangelicals really tend to focus on the resurrection of Jesus. Catholics tend to focus on the substitutionary atoning death of Jesus. He's the suffering servant of 2nd Isaiah for Catholics by default. I'm speaking in broad generalizations here, but you get the idea. But the Eastern Orthodox churches really root their understanding of who God is and who Jesus is in the incarnation. And with these different theological emphases come different theologies of the atonement. So Catholics are going to have kind of an orientation that we're not saved from suffering, but through suffering. Evangelicals are going to have a kind of an orientation where we are delivered on the far side of some suffering into triumphant new life, where all things are possible and greater things are yet to be done because God's coming again and the new heavens, the new earth, and new creation are imminent. But in the Eastern Church, they're focused so much on the incarnation, on the here and now, and the fact that God became flesh, that things like eating, walking, breathing have a sacral significance that's completely lost on the other branches of Christian spirituality, again, in broad strokes. So I really wanted to explore that Eastern approach. I wanted to explore it in Eastern music. I wanted to explore it in Orthodox writers and thinkers. I wanted to explore it through the Thomist Church and bring in those kind of samples from the kind of worship that those people do and safely introduce it to our church. And then I wanted to do the same thing with Africa, because there's a massive tradition of Christian spirituality in Africa, in Egypt, in Alexandria, in the Christian church as it exists now in Kenya, in Uganda, of course in South Africa, and just like with our own history, none of those are necessarily problem-free, but they are African. They are specifically African, and so we have great African theologians. Gosh, off the top of my head, Bishop Desmond Tutu radically changed the world as he helped to undo the systemic oppression of apartheid, and more significantly, as he helped to rebuild the people of South Africa, trying to unify them through the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I mean, there's just amazing African Christianity, and I wanted to highlight that, and I wanted to celebrate that. I wanted to pay homage to the great Black voices of not only of history but of today. And so we had 1 week that was really on the Eastern Church, India, China, all the way up into the Orthodox tradition in Russia and Asia Minor. At 1 week that was really focused on African Christianity, again, historical African Christianity and also contemporary African Christianity. And then 1 week where we focused on Western Christianity. And here I wanted to sort of skip over the Reformation. Not that I don't think it was important, just that that's what everybody's familiar with. Everybody knows to quote Zwingli and Calvin and Martin Luther. And then, of course, everybody loves the Great Awakening. You get Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley and George Whitefield. And then everybody knows kind of the puritanical movement of Christian America, and great revivalist preachers like Billy Sunday or Billy Graham. But I wanted to kind of slip in and around all the cracks and find different music, and I wanted to find different authors and ways to cite and honor different voices. And so for some, that whole process of bringing all that together with contemporary worship music and modern preaching was a really rich intellectual exercise. For others, it was a dud, because we were playing music they didn't know and didn't like, as we're quoting from all these other traditions. And we were bringing up voices they'd never heard of and theologies with which they were largely unfamiliar. And for about half of my congregation, it just felt like they were being indoctrinated into a new religion, because there was no comfort or familiarity or desire for familiarity with the records of the historical church. So that was like my favorite of the experiments in form, primarily because of how we thought about it theologically. But again, it was only partway a success. I think maybe the most successful experiments that I did in form were those that were necessitated by the pandemic. So we did, I think, 14 different kinds of church services during the pandemic. We did drive-in church, where people sat in their cars and listened to church on the radio. We did drive-through church, where people could drive through a little pathway in the church parking lot, and they'd receive prayer at one station. They'd receive the Eucharist at another station. They'd receive a thumb drive or a CD or something with a message in another station, something for their kids to do. We did 15-minute church services to try and get people in and out nice and quick. We did Zoom church, of course, like everybody did, where I would broadcast from my house, and the worship team would all play synchronously through different places in their house. We did in-room church, but with masks and assigned seating, so there were 3 or 5 empty seats between everybody. We did church just in my office, where we filmed it almost like a green room concert or a tiny desk concert. We did conversation church, where we just did things through Q&A and allowed people to sort of write and choose their own liturgy as it happened, where they could interject and go back and forth. And perhaps the thing that was my favorite was the designer at our church, Melissa Evans. She designed these opera boxes so that families could come in and sit together in the auditorium during church. So from my perspective on the stage, looking out, it looked like there were about 30 different chicken coops in the room. And, maybe 6 to 10 people could each fit inside of one of these boxes. And the boxes themselves looked really cool, and they were reasonably comfortable. They were well built. And then her design team gave each box its own sort of personality or flair, picking one of the animals in Scripture, and so there was a lion box, and so then there were some scriptures in there about Jesus being the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and there was a sheep box, and then there were some scriptures in there about what it's like for us to be people like sheep without a shepherd, or for Jesus to be our good shepherd. And then there was the dragon box to talk about the seraphim, which are the worshiping angels in Scripture, coming from a word that means fiery flying serpent. And then there was a phoenix box with that reference to the old King James Bible that talks about the mythological bird. And then there was a unicorn box. So all those boxes were not only like interesting and comfortable and a meaningful solution to the problem of human safety and more significantly human anxiety in the midst of the pandemic, but those boxes also serve to create a setting within the setting and to feed forward in the mindset, so you had lots to sort of stimulate you and lots of spiritual content in each of those boxes that would get you thinking along a particular way. So those were very well received. And then we would just sort of do normal church, and people would stand up and worship in their box or take notes in their box or whatever. But those were fun moments where the way we experimented with the form helped people engage and encounter God in a new way. Our chief response to the pandemic, when we were trying to, like everybody else, we were losing our minds trying to figure out how we're going to take care of our people. Because, of course, half of our people thought it was ridiculous that we would even acknowledge there was a pandemic. They thought it was all a government plot, and that the vaccines were a hoax and masks were a form of control. And we were very heavily criticized for even acknowledging that the pandemic was a consideration. And then the other half of our people were right the other way. They couldn't believe that we weren't all just staying at home, hiding, cowering, waiting for the government to save us. And of course, both sides just blasted us nonstop. And it seemed like the right way forward for us was to increase the amount of spiritual nourishment and content that we could provide, again, primarily through the internet. And so we began to offer something called the breviary. Now, in church tradition, a breviary is a daily series of devotional, scriptural messages, liturgies, church services, following the canonical hours. In monastic culture, every 3 hours there's some sort of church service that has been designed for the monks to observe in their time in the monastery. So we thought, well, what if we offer those kind of services on the internet through our breviary? So we had matin services and vesper services, morning meditations. We had some services that were just worship, some that were just teaching, some in which we offered the sacraments. We gave people an opportunity to remember their baptism. We gave people opportunity to receive the Eucharist. We gave people the opportunity to receive holy orders, to be set apart, to confess, to repent. And all those things were, I think, at some point meaningful. I think the overall experience of the breviary for our church was very helpful. It allowed us to stay in touch with our people. It allowed us to sort of set our own narrative that, yes, the world is falling apart, but Jesus is still king, and we as the people of God are able to overcome. But then, of course, some of the experiments we did with it just weren't super helpful, and we were able to pivot pretty quickly. We did one morning meditation for a little while. That was just some soft music that played for 2 or 3 minutes and a simple reflection, usually a quote from a famous Christian writer. And those were, I thought those were really neat, kind of a meditative way to reset your mind. But they would get, the smallest amount of views of anything that we did. People just didn't find the content engaging. So we didn't do it for long. And then we did some that were live services during the breviary, so people could, tune in on time, so to speak, and see us, doing a little bit of music or maybe, giving a message or offering the Eucharist. And a certain kind of people really liked tuning in live. Other kind of people sort of waited till the music was done so they could just get the message. And other kinds of people sort of, watched the music and then would turn it off during the message. So we experimented with all those kind of things, and in large part, it was very meaningful to a lot of people and allowed us to keep certainly our preachers and our artists engaged in the whole process. But what I learned from all these different forms is that the form really has to come second. Now, the form is useful, changing up the order of service, incorporating different things that we're doing. It really helps to get people out of their ruts, but the form still has to serve the function, meaning it still has to provide a meaningful spiritual experience for everybody involved. And again, the best way you can help them do that is to give them some cues to lead them and get them in the right mindset and help them know what kind of setting they're coming into. Now, growing up as a charismatic, one of the things that often was so powerful about church services were the things that we called altar times or altar ministry times. So, in a classical Pentecostal church or in a charismatic church or tent revival church, there would always be time after the message where people could come up and receive prayer at the altar. And sometimes people would give their lives to Jesus, and sometimes people would pray for God's intervention. Sometimes people had really intense emotional experiences at the altar. I certainly had plenty of those, and those were always really special to me. What I liked about those was how particular they were. Like, we were all having a spiritual experience together, but in the midst of this communal experience, there was also a particular touch from God that would come to me or to you during our time at the altar. What I didn't like about that was that it could very easily become over-emotionalized and sensationalized rather. And sometimes people would get flaky and weird, and sometimes people would pay absolutely no attention to anything that happened during the church at all, and then they'd just go up and have a big cry at the end. And if they had their Holy Ghost moment, then they were okay. And that tended to produce unstable and slightly flaky Christians. So I always had some concern about it. There are other times in Pentecostal charismatic churches where you'll do altar ministry in the middle of the service. The church that I grew up in and also the church that I attend now, 2 different churches, they would typically put that altar ministry time before the sermon in an effort to try and reduce the concern of spiritual manipulation or emotionalization. And that was a better way to do it, I thought, in many ways. It made for less intense and less frequent experiences and encounters of God, but also it felt healthier, saner. Felt like the whole person was involved, not just the extremities of their emotional well-being. And when I changed out of a Pentecostal charismatic church and came to a non-denominational church, they had nothing like that at all. So church was a very intellectual exercise. I mean, even if you were having a great experience in worship, even if you felt a kind of emotional stirring, it only was going to go so far. Nobody was going to get too excited. Anyway, so to help facilitate all that, we designed what were end games. We wanted to have the intellect brought together with the experience so that people could meaningfully encounter God in a new way. And so what we would do is we would script the last few minutes of the sermon with the first few moments of the music to try and do cognitively and artistically what great Pentecostals and black preachers and black churches would do rather intuitively. I mean, they just sort of knew when to play, and they just sort of knew what to say and what to do, and it just all sort of flowed and provided some pretty meaningful things. For us, we didn't know what to say and didn't know what to do. It wasn't our tradition, and so we thought, well, we are good at composing, so let's compose. Let's try and make something together. And so the last 5 minutes of the sermon and the first 5 minutes of the music, about a 10-minute thing, we referred to as an end game. And so we'd script our lighting changes and we'd script our musical changes and when people would come in, what exhortations would be said and what scriptures would be read. And we were very careful not to design those as manipulative spiritual experiences, or we the nice part about composing it is you could sort of back off. You could sort of know which times you were too on the nose. You could know which times didn't feel really good, and you had to just think a little bit differently about what was going on to make sure that you didn't stretch too far or do anything too goofy. And so the playing with that convention made for a really meaningful marriage of creativity, intellect, and experience. And when you're designing an experience like that, you can decide, is this going to be a somber experience? I mean, what kind of tone are we going for? How can we facilitate that? Do we want to give people an opportunity to hear from God? Do we want to give people an opportunity to come up to the front and receive prayer? Do we want this to be a moment where people get genuinely excited, and if so, how can we facilitate that? Now, you can't ever make it happen. I suppose in certain places they can make it happen. They can manipulate others, but I certainly never had that skill. I was never a good enough preacher to whoop the crowd into a frenzy. I was never emotional enough preacher that I could make people cry on command. So that was just, I just don't have that in me. I think maybe in deep inside my person, I have an aversion to such things. And so there's sort of a fail-safe inside of me that keeps it from being too on the nose. But designing those end games allowed us really to marry the best of all the worlds, to have fun creating something, to drive towards a particular moment that was an invitation, not an expectation or a pressure, and to do so in intellectually credible, biblically sound ways, consistent with the historical witness of the church. So that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing those. Other experiments that we did, open mic services, choose your own adventure services, call and response readings, disembodied readings. I mean, we did rotations of different stations throughout the building, prayer labyrinths, meaningful asynchronous prayer exercise. We just kind of tried all kinds of things. But again, the thing that's got to matter is people have to encounter God. If the form gets in the way of them encountering God, then all of a sudden they're ticked off. And I'm ticked off because, like I said, I think church ought to be spiritual. So if we go to all this work and we work so hard on something and it doesn't cultivate a meaningful encounter with the Holy Spirit, that feels like a failure on my part. So back to the earlier comment of somebody going, why can't you just do what works? I go, well, yeah, sometimes creativity doesn't work like that. Sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you screw it up. And there was never anybody more frustrated by that than me, because I really want people to encounter God. I love designing spiritual experiences. I love inviting people into the presence of God. I love being I call it the congealed presence of God, because God's always present. He's never not here. But there's a sense in which sometimes we're more available to him. We feel like we've shown up a little more. So yeah, the congealed sense of the presence of God. Anyway, now let's just talk briefly about designing designing liturgy as a story. And I like to think about the whole liturgical experience as one experience. It's not the worship and then the preaching, or it's not like, we'll do worship and then we have announcements and then altar time and then preaching. No. It's one thing. You design it like you're going to an underground show in Soho in New York City. You design it like you're going to an exclusive Vegas experience. You design it like you're going to and I think the Catholics and the Orthodox Church do this really well. I mean, you go and you have the readings that are for the day and whatever liturgical year you're in, A, B, or C, and they've got the gospel reading, and they've got the scripture, and they've got the sacraments that'll be administered, and time for confession, and time for recitation of the creeds. I mean, the whole thing is scripted. Now, what I don't like about that is that it can feel quite wooden and a bit stutter start, okay, you go, then I go, then you say this, then I say this, then the people say this, then the pastor says that. So it's all a bit goofy, but those transitions are really helped, and the whole thing is brought together with music, particularly with well-crafted, well-composed music through either a great keyboard player, organist, ambient guitar player. I mean, you just or just a band. You think the whole thing through. So when you're going to design this whole spiritual experience, you kind of figure out, well, how long should it be? 60 minutes, 45 minutes, hour and a half, whatever. Your tradition typically determines that. If you're in a black church, it's going to be 3 hours long. If you're a charismatic church, it's going to be 2 hours long. I mean, the church I grew up in, it was, almost an hour and 45 minutes every single service of my life. In the church that I pastored, I cut out all the silly stuff that I thought was a waste of time. I hated when we'd spend 10 minutes for announcements. Oh, announcements are the bane of spiritual experience. How can you have an encounter with God when somebody's up there fumbling their way through a flyer they've never read, and they don't know when the car wash is or why the mission trip is going or even who's included? Announcements. Drive me nuts. Anyway, church, when I was lead pastor at church, we tried to keep church to an hour. So you're designing this whole hour as one story. And then you got to start and figure out whose story is this going to be? Like, is this the story of God trying to get hold of the people? Is this the story of the people coming to find God? Is this the story of our church? Is this the story of an individual person? Are we telling a biblical story? So this is the story of Jonah, or this is the story of Ruth, or this is the story of David. You just got to ask the question, whose story are we telling today? And there's no wrong answer there. Sometimes people get really persnickety and, well, this is clearly the story of God, and we're the people of God, and if God isn't framing our story, then we've got a real problem. Well, I know why people feel good when they get the soapbox and jump up and down and dance and get mad and self-righteous. It's just not super helpful. It's not super enjoyable to be in that meeting. It's really not enjoyable to be in that person's company. So just knock it off. We're trying to talk about how we bring everybody together into the presence of God so that we are continually changed. And one helpful way to do that is to design the service like a story and ask whose story is it this week or this series. And then you got to ask what do they want? Like this person whose story it is. What do they want, and what are they willing to do to get it? And then why can't they have it? Like, what gets in the way? And then if they get everything they want and things work out in unexpectedly beautiful, amazing ways, how's that going to work? So these are the critical questions in storytelling, and I use the acronym DARK to help me remember this. Now, film critic and screenwriting coach Robert McKee wrote this amazing book called Story, in which he teaches filmmakers how to write scripts. And DARK is my sort of synthesis of Robert McKee's book Story. And McKee has been criticized because everybody who goes through his screenwriting class ends up, writing screenplays that sort of feel the same. Think of all the Marvel movies, or think of, just how every movie sort of feels like it has the same kind of beats in it and moments in it. Robert McKee is brilliant, but maybe the way people apply his teaching isn't always brilliant. Maybe it gets a bit samey and formulaic. But anyway, DARK is the acronym that I derived to help me remember all of the great things that Robert McKee had to teach in his book, Story. And so it stands for desire, action, resistance, and kick. So again, I go, whose story is this, and what desire do they have? For example, today in the liturgy, are we telling the story of humanity? And what is humanity's desire? What is it that we as people want? Do we want meaning or significance? Do we want passion or love or adventure? Do we want unity? Do we want peace? What do we think people want? And how are we going to talk about it today? Now, you might go, well, maybe this should all be decided upon by the sermon. Maybe we should design our services so that they support the sermon. You can do that, and that is the way that most people do it. That's not the way that I ever wanted to do it. Because even though I was the lead pastor and even though I was the preacher, the truth is I was much more concerned about how all the different creative voices were coming together to tell a story. So I wanted to hear from the worship designer, and I wanted to hear from the graphic designer and the media designer, and I wanted to hear from the small groups person and the kids person, so that we all together were shaping this story for the good of the church and the edification of the body. So anyway, you're asking the question, whose story is it? What do they want? And then, so what are they willing to do to get it? Like, again, if we're telling the story of humanity and what humanity really wants is meaning and significance, well, what do they do to get it? Well, they build a Tower of Babel, or maybe they build an ark, or maybe they try and conquer the people next to them, or maybe they flex their muscles in international relations in the Ukraine or the Sudan or North Korea. I mean, like, people do all kinds of things, some of them quite beautiful. Maybe they craft enduring works of art. Maybe they go off by themselves to pray and pore over a manuscript. Maybe they do any number of things. But you think about why do people do what they do? And in large part, it's because they're trying to meet this desire that they have. But it doesn't always work out. There's always resistance, like Stephen Pressfield says in The War of Art. There's always resistance. And what shape does that resistance take? Is it supernatural, spiritual? Is it the devil, the accuser, the enemy of their soul, roaming about, searching for whom he might devour? Well, maybe, yeah. Or it could just be my own ego or narcissism or my own lack of competence. Sometimes people don't get what they want because they're foolish and stupid. Sometimes it's because they lose their way. They don't have the staying power, the endurance. There's all kinds of reasons why people don't get what they want. So how do we tell that in the liturgy? Well, maybe through a time of confession, or maybe through a time of repentance, maybe through a time of reflective prayer or journaling, maybe through a Kyrie, where we can give a litany of all these kind of reasons why people don't get what they want, and sort of baptize that litany in the name of the Father and the prayer. And then ultimately we want the liturgy to kick them back out into the world and say, all right, you're sort of supercharged, you're aware, you're clear on some things and what you want and what stopped you this for. Now go with the grace of God and keep moving forward, and let's see what we can do to make changes in the future. So that's the basic structure of the liturgy, is dark. And I want my sermons to have it dark. I want the whole liturgy to have it dark. I want the worship portion of the liturgy to have it dark, and all these are kind of nested in to each other like Marushka dolls. And you can get as fancy with this or as simple or as plain as you like, but that's the basic structure. And again, you're going to try and go through all the classic elements of the liturgy: invocation, call to worship, reading of the word, proclamation of the gospel, prayer, intercession, offering, praise and worship, sacrament, ritual, confession, absolution, benediction. Those are all the kind of things that you're going to give opportunity for people to do. And I do think it's important that the actual congregants do something. I think it's important that in liturgy, people understand they have a role to play. I mean, the word liturgy means the work of the people, So what work are we inviting the people to do as they come to church? And I really think it's important to think about the difference between, agents and patients. I mean, agents do things, patients have things done to them. And so often in church, we're doing things to the people instead of the people doing anything. So I always want to increase the number of verbs that are true as we describe what the people did, because typically Joe Blow comes to church, he stands there during the music, maybe he sings, probably not, stands there and holds his coffee, then he sits down, he listens to the sermon, maybe he takes notes, probably not, then he maybe gives some money and leaves. So the verbs that are true for Joe Blow are, stand, listen, give money. And so I would think, well, how does Joe Blow pray? How does Joe Blow confess his sins? How does Joe Blow reflect meaningfully on the scripture beyond just what he's hearing? How does Joe Blow bless the other people next to him? How does Joe Blow receive the sacrament? So what can I get Joe Blow to do? Because the things that we do have a spiritual transformational power upon the people that God is calling us to become. So the more I can get Joe to be active and engaged, the more Joe is going to have a spiritual experience. Now, you can't always make Joe do stuff because Joe's pretty grumpy sometimes, and he doesn't want to write his feelings on a piece of paper and burn it up at an altar. Joe's got some resistance, but I still want to provide opportunity for Joe to do something other than just sit there and at the end tell everybody who did something on stage how cool they are. So agents are active. whereas patients are passive. Agents exercise some measure of control. They decide when and how they're going to engage, even if that means they're not going to engage at all. Whereas patients are just people that sit there. They just sort of watch or listen or take it all in. They're in the quote unquote the spiritual waiting room of God's hospital. Agents are people that are on assignment. They're gonna do stuff. They're gonna make stuff happen. They're the main character. But patients just kind of show up and wait for somebody else to do something in hopes it happens. So when we want to create meaningful engagement in worship and mission and formation, we try and give people agency. And you see, I think, how all these things work together. If we're going to design spiritual experiences that are innovative and creative and experimental, we're going to have to make sure people are in the right mindset and they have some expectation about the setting. And then when they come into this unfamiliar thing, we want to make sure that we're telling a story, because stories have power. They get people caught up into them. They allow people to reflect on their own lives, their own values, what God is saying to them. There's some critical components that we want to include in that storytelling thing. And then more than anything, we want to make sure that we give them agency so that they know who they are, what they're doing, what controls they have over their own life, and whether or not they're allowed to engage God on their own terms, or whether or not they have to engage God on our terms. Because make no mistake, it's on somebody's terms. It would be nice to say, well, God is the one who should set the terms. But God doesn't tend to show up like that. God allows us to make a tremendous amount of decisions. And so usually we're just, like I said earlier, we're inflicting our decisions upon people instead of inviting them to be a part of it. So, like I said, there's a million things that we could talk about when we talk about liturgy. But here's some of the ones that I haven't heard too many other people address that I wanted to give some relief to, and share some of the anecdotes about what went well and what went wrong. And it's crazy because really the most meaningful spiritual experiences that I've been able to supply have happened like this in church. And yet some of the biggest misses I've ever had have happened like this in church. And for the elation and the revelation and the inspiration, the deepening of people's faith, it's tough to beat a great church service. I mean, it really, really is. But on the same hand, you can also disappoint, frustrate, and unintentionally isolate or alienate people through a church service that just feels like it got too clever for its own good. So if you take away one thing from this whole podcast, take away the thing that matters most is not the form, but the function. Help people connect with God. All right, grace and peace, everybody. We'll see you next week for our next episode.